Portlock was cursed and Bigfoot's place and nobody goes there.
Portlock, Alaska, has long been whispered about as the site of a hidden, terrifying Bigfoot incident that some people believe scientists would rather ignore. Its story is filled with unexplained disappearances, eerie howls in the forest, and encounters with a towering, hairy creature that drove entire communities to flee. Were these myths created by frightened settlers, or is something genuine lurking in the Alaskan wilderness? Let's explore the details of Portlock's haunting history, the persistent local legends, and how it all still captivates us today. The early mysteries and first abandonments. Portlock's tale began centuries ago, with whispers shared between explorers, native communities, and fortune seekers hoping to strike it rich in Alaska's wilderness. The land itself seemed extremely generous at first glance. Its coastal location offered excellent fishing opportunities, the forests were full of game, and the surrounding terrain was thought to be perfect for establishing a strong, prosperous settlement. Yet the first significant hint of trouble appeared in 1785, when British Captain Nathaniel Portlock and his crew arrived. They discovered remnants of an abandoned native village, which raised immediate questions. Why would anyone leave such a resource-rich area, especially after going through the effort of building a community? Captain Portlock's men soon experienced sickness, dread, and an overwhelming pressure to abandon the site. There was nothing obviously threatening, no large armies or known predators that would scare off seasoned sailors. But the acute terror kept growing. Over the next few weeks, the men suffered fevers, unsettling nightmares, and eerie chills that seemed to settle into their bones. Superstition thrived on ships back in that era, and the crew soon begged Portlock to sail away. Evidence suggests Spanish explorers, 6 years earlier, had encountered similarly bizarre circumstances. They too felt sick and frightened by strange cries echoing from the forest, eventually leaving in a hurry. One modern theory suggests infrasound might have played a role in these unsettling experiences. Infrasound consists of ultra-low frequency vibrations that humans can't consciously hear, but can still perceive physically. It can cause nausea, anxiety, disorientation, and an inexplicable sense of dread. Large predators like certain whales, tigers, and possibly other creatures can produce infrasound to unnerve prey. Could a mysterious predator native to the Portlock region have generated infrasound inadvertently or deliberately affecting anyone who ventured too close? There is no direct proof, but this intriguing possibility adds a scientific explanation to the eerie sense of doom that drove two different groups of explorers away in the 1700s. Encounters with cannibal giants and native tales. By 1867, a group known as the Sugak attempted to settle in Portlock, despite disturbing rumors passed along by other native groups. At first, everything seemed promising. The bountiful fish runs, easy hunting, and fertile land were cause for excitement. The community began to plant, fish, and hunt with high expectations. But it didn't take long before they started to tell terrifying stories of raids at night, perpetrated by large, hairy beings they called the Nak. These so-called cannibal giants were described as half-human, half-beast, and were said to stand taller than the average man, with enormous strength that made them seem nearly unstoppable. According to these accounts, the Anak had a gruesome habit of hunting people when other game grew scarce. Villagers reported missing family members, torn apart animal carcasses, and strange footprints larger than any humans. Some insisted they heard blood-curdling shrieks echoing through the night, while others saw glimpses of something bulky and fast darting between the trees at dusk or dawn. As fear spread, the Sugak tried to defend their new home. Fortifications were built, nightly watches were organized, and people avoided venturing into secluded forested areas alone. But even with these precautions, the sense of vulnerability lingered. Over time, more attacks occurred, sometimes leaving behind evidence so horrific that entire families decided to flee with little more than the clothing on their backs. Eventually, the Sugak left entirely, convinced that the land was cursed or that the Anak were too dangerous to challenge. Their stories, a combination of raw terror, supernatural claims, and real human losses, became legends that neighboring communities took seriously. They warned one another to steer clear of Portlock, claiming that its thick woodlands hid monstrous secrets. Over the decades, These tales evolved and spread, shaping a broad narrative that pointed to Portlock as a place of malevolent forces. The arrival of the Utic and the push for modernity. In 1921, another group, known as the Utic, sometimes referred to as the Utic or other variants of the name, arrived in Portlock with modern ideas and industrious resolve. They had heard the frightening stories from the area's past, but many believed that with the right security measures, advanced equipment, and a strong work ethic, they could conquer whatever lurked in the forests. The village they built included a cannery, a school, and even a post office, clear signs that they intended to establish a permanent, thriving settlement. To prevent any trouble, they instituted strict safety protocols from the start. Nighttime curfews were enforced so that no one would be caught alone in the dark. Armed guards patrolled the outskirts of the settlement. Children were kept within designated areas, guarded carefully by adults, especially if it was near dusk. Most reminiscent of the warnings from previous inhabitants, there was also a firm prohibition against venturing too far into the fog-shrouded woods. In those early years, these measures seemed to work. The settlement flourished, families felt optimistic, and the canneries operated efficiently, generating much-needed commerce. Over time, though, prosperity bred a sense of complacency. The original security rules became harder to maintain as the village expanded. New residents, unaware or skeptical of the old stories, saw no reason to fear the thick forests or keep watch at night. Some teenagers, drawn by curiosity or the sense of forbidden adventure, ignored the warnings and went exploring after dark. Loggers, eager to gather timber, pushed deeper inland, setting up small encampments far from the village. This false sense of security set the stage for tragedy. Bit by bit, strange incidents started happening again. People claimed they heard guttural cries late at night. Some claimed to see large footprints near streams where men fished or hunted. However, these early warning signs were not enough to stir the entire community into returning to their strict protective measures. It was not until a logger named Andrew Camlock died under horrifying circumstances in 1931 that Portlock's terrifying legend came roaring back into the spotlight. Andrew Camlock's death and renewed fear. Andrew Camlock was an experienced woodsman, known for his skill in the forest and his calm approach to even the toughest challenges. When he ventured deeper into the woods than anyone else had before, it was largely because he believed in the area's potential for valuable timber that could benefit the expanding settlement. One day, he did not return to camp at the expected time. His co-workers initially assumed he had decided to stay overnight in the forest, a common practice if logging ran long. But when another day passed with no sign of Andrew, a search party was quickly organized. What they found was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Andrew's body was discovered in a gruesome state. His head had been crushed, apparently struck with force so intense that his own sled was hurled some distance away. The dogs that had accompanied him were torn apart, scattered around the site. Investigators and villagers alike were stunned by the sheer brutality. No ordinary bear attack leaves such evidence. The sled, which was heavy and unwieldy, should have been almost impossible to fling so far. It looked as though someone, or something, of enormous strength had attacked Andrew, and perhaps his dogs, with terrifying power. News of this tragedy spread through Portlock almost instantly. Fear spiked. Logging crews became panicked, demanding safer working conditions, or refusing to go out at all unless heavily armed and in groups. Some declared that the Enak, the legendary half-man, half-beast creature from local tales, was undoubtedly behind this attack. Others clung to the idea that it must have been a particularly aggressive bear, though it was hard to justify the unexplainable strength necessary to move the sled. Shortly after Andrew's death, a resident named Tom Olson reported seeing a gigantic, hairy figure stalking the beach. He claimed it walked upright like a man, but had the massive, thick frame that matched the rumored Enak. Tom, despite carrying a rifle, was so overcome with fear that he froze, unable to raise his weapon or even call for help. This sighting added credibility to the whispered claims that something very real and very dangerous inhabited Portlock's forests. For the Utic, Andrew's death was a turning point. Old caution returned, armed patrols resumed, curfews became stricter, and an undercurrent of dread settled heavily over daily life. Vanishings, savage footprints, and a town on edge. After Andrew Camlock's shocking death, vanishings and grisly discoveries elevated the panic in Portlock to new heights. Hunters who ventured out solo would fail to return, their bodies later discovered nearly unrecognizable, bearing vicious wounds that suggested a powerful assailant. In some cases, Only fragments of clothing or personal items were located, eerie reminders of what might have happened in the deep woods. A pattern emerged. The more isolated a person was, the more likely they were to become a victim. This reality made travelers insist on going out in pairs or larger groups, which slowed most forms of commerce and daily life. As fear spread, certain individuals began to share older tales. Elders recounted the experiences of the Sugak from decades earlier, how they had battled these cannibal giants to no avail. Others repeated warnings from various tribes about straying too far into the forest or taunting local spirits. Such stories, once dismissed by skeptics as mere superstition, took on a new urgency when weighed against the horrifying evidence around them. There were also numerous reports of footprints, massive, human-like tracks that dwarfed any normal foot, measuring well over 18 inches in length. A few adventurous types tried making plaster casts, but the thick mud and challenging terrain often ruined their attempts. Despite the lack of perfect evidence, word of these footprints circulated widely, adding to the tension. Some neutral observers believed that perhaps a massive bear or a known apex predator was involved. Alaska is, after all, home to brown and black bears that can reach astonishing sizes. But these prints, shaped more like human feet with a distinct heel and toe formation, did not match a bear's paw shape. Panic grew further when travelers found lean-tos or small outposts ransacked or destroyed in ways that a typical animal might not manage. Supplies were missing or tossed about, and occasionally odd hair samples showed up on debris. All these eerie signs strengthened the notion that a cunning, powerful, and seemingly vengeful presence was behind Portlock's darkest secrets. The 1950 mass exodus and the tipping point. By 1950, Portlock had transformed from an optimistic settlement to a place paralyzed by fear. The unexplained fatalities piled up, with some estimates suggesting as many as 2 or 3 dozen people had gone missing under brutal circumstances since the settlement's founding. Stories circulated of families who would pack up secretly in the middle of the night, leaving behind homes, personal treasures, and even half-finished meals. The exodus seemed unplanned, and yet had a clear cause. People were too terrified to remain. Tensions reached a breaking point when seasoned hunters and loggers, those once considered the bravest in the settlement, began to vanish as well. Many believed the Anak, or Bigfoot-like creature, had grown bolder, striking closer and closer to the village. Patrols were doubled, curfews extended, and families locked doors and windows as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. But none of these measures seemed sufficient to stop the sense of a looming presence, only a breath away from doing unimaginable harm. Eventually, large groups left in haste, carrying what they could, but abandoning years' worth of community development. Cannery workers who had once boasted about the town's productivity stopped showing up. Teachers closed the school's doors, leaving behind chalk, textbooks, and student projects. The post office, one of the essential markers of a legitimate town, was nearly the last official outpost to close. The postmaster himself stayed for a short while, determined to tie up official obligations. Later, he told close friends how he spent several sleepless nights holed up in the post office, hearing thumping footsteps that seemed more human than animal, but were far too heavy to be ordinary. Eventually, even his sense of duty gave way. He locked up and left Portlock behind. Post-abandonment sightings and intensifying mystique. With the settlement empty, Portlock was consumed by wild vegetation. Roofs caved under the weight of heavy rains and snowfall, windows shattered in storms, and animals reclaimed the space that humans once called home. But, ironically, perhaps because no one officially lived there, Portlock's reputation grew all the more eerie. Handsome buildings that had once symbolized progress became skeletal monuments to the terror that had driven everyone away. Adventurous hunters or curious travelers occasionally passed through Portlock, either by boat or by land, using the deserted structures as temporary shelter from sudden storms. Countless stories emerged from these brief sojourns. Some individuals camped there for a night, only to be awakened by eerie growls circling their tents, or by footsteps crunching on gravel far heavier than a typical animal. More than one group claimed to find giant footprints in the mud next to the old cannery or on the beach. One group of hunters, while waiting out a storm, recounted hearing something rummaging through debris outside, occasionally uttering a low, rumbling sound that felt almost too guttural to be a bear. When they stepped outside at dawn, they found massive footprints leading away toward the forest's edge. In the 1970s, a small group of outdoorsmen reported a terrifying night spent in the old settlement. They described hearing something violently rattle the makeshift barricade they had placed against a door. Though the entity never broke in, they were convinced that no ordinary animal would behave in such a targeted, persistent way. Another anecdote from that era involves moose hunters who discovered an area where moose tracks ended abruptly amid churned-up vegetation. Right beside it were footprints that resembled a huge, bare human foot. They could only conclude that something astonishingly large and strong took down the moose and dragged it off without leaving much of a trace. These sorts of stories continued to surface, reinforcing the idea that the beast that once terrorized Portlock was still around, or that multiple creatures like it roamed the area. In 1990, a chilling encounter with an elderly Utic man provided a glimpse into how deeply the fear of Portlock's creature still ran. After hearing someone mention the forest near Portlock, the man visibly trembled and demanded to know if they had seen it. His uncontrolled terror, even decades after leaving the region, underscored just how profoundly these experiences had shaped the lives of those who had once called Portlock home. Theories, skepticism, and competing narratives. While numerous people remain convinced that Portlock suffered repeated assaults by a cryptid, commonly referred to as the Anak or a type of Bigfoot, others seek more rational explanations. Bears are often cited as one possibility. Alaska's grizzlies can be aggressive, particularly if they feel threatened or if food is scarce. They also possess formidable strength that could account for at least some of the damage described. In rare cases, a bear might drag a sled some distance. Still, the detail that certain victims' bodies were found with injuries seemingly beyond traditional bear attacks, plus the consistent presence of footprints resembling massive human-like prints, muddy the bear theory waters. Another scientific angle is the infrasound hypothesis. Low-frequency vibrations, generated by large predators or even natural phenomena like shifting tectonic plates, could induce the severe dread that early explorers felt. Yet this doesn't explain the savage maulings and uprooted trees. Speaking of trees, one of the strangest claims is that entire trees were found rammed into the ground upside down, their roots sticking into the air. Some attribute this phenomenon to storms, while others see it as evidence of an incredibly strong and deliberate perpetrator marking territory. Economic factors may also have played a key role in the final exodus. Sally Ash, a living elder from the Utic community, downplays the monstrous elements of the story and insists that people left mostly due to better job opportunities and improved educational and religious institutions in neighboring towns. However, she also acknowledges that while they lived in Portlock, they maintained constant vigilance and adhered to a list of strict rules, suggesting that it wasn't purely mundane concerns driving them out. Meanwhile, Sally's cousin, Melania Kell, openly recounts the tales of a frightening creature that attacked residents and forced them to flee. She even gave an interview describing how the beast terrorized Portlock, contradicting Sally's downplaying of the cryptid angle. This conflict within the same family speaks volumes about the difficulty of pinning down the truth. Oral histories can be shaped by personal perspectives, generational differences, and attempts to protect one's heritage, or avoid sensationalizing a dark chapter in a community's past. Global connections and cultural reflections. Portlock's predicament, the interplay of actual tragic events with stories of a fearsome, possibly supernatural creature, echoes phenomena seen around the world. Tales of the Yeti roam the snowy Himalayas. Bigfoot sightings pepper Pacific Northwestern lore, and the Sasquatch is part of many First Nations narratives in Canada. The repeated theme is a large, hairy, human-like figure lurking in wilderness regions. Experts argue that such stories reflect both a fear of untamed nature and perhaps a cultural memory of times when humans were not at the top of the food chain. In many cultures, these giant, hairy beings are not just physically imposing, but also cunning and sometimes malicious, underlining humanity's deep-seated anxieties about the unknown. Some cryptozoologists speculate that these creatures could be remnants of older human or primate species that survived in remote pockets, away from mainstream human expansion. Fossil records do show that archaic human relatives like the Denisovans or robust hominins once roamed parts of Asia. Could the Anak be an offshoot of such a lineage, persisting in Alaska's vast wilderness? While the official scientific community has not embraced this notion, The consistent reports of large footprints, big upright silhouettes, and unsettling calls in remote forests worldwide keep the speculation alive. For those who study folklore and anthropology, the Portlock saga offers a prime example of how myths can take root in actual tragic events. The terror that once gripped the community was real. People died, families were traumatized, and eventually an entire town was abandoned. Whether that terror was caused by a cryptid or by more mundane explanations remains an open question. But the effect of these stories, how they shape communal identity, reflect values, and linger through generations, is palpable. Preservation, ongoing research, and the enduring enigma. Today, Portlock is a ghost town in physical terms. Buildings crumble amid towering spruce trees, the canneries lie in ruins, and the hush of the wind through the forest covers any remaining traces of daily life. But the legend refuses to fade. In recent years, as the possibilities of advanced technology have grown, new interest groups, cryptozoologists, documentary filmmakers, explorers, and curious private individuals have taken the opportunity to research the site more methodically. Some bring drone technology to survey inaccessible parts of the terrain, searching for patches of forest that might show unusual patterns or large creatures. Others carry thermal imaging devices in hopes of capturing an unknown bipedal figure lurking in the dense undergrowth. Archaeological studies are also underway, at least in a limited capacity, delving into the remains of structures, tools, and artifacts left behind when the town was abandoned. These researchers want to understand Portlock's repeated attempts at settlement. What was the day-to-day life like for those who lived there? Did they leave behind written records or diaries that might shed light on the severity of the threats they faced? So far, the narrative remains patchy. Official documents mention unexplained disappearances and dangerous animals, but none contain conclusive proof of a hairy giant or supernatural force. Meanwhile, the Utic and other native groups still share stories from their oral traditions. Many younger community members inherit these narratives from older generations, preserving them as part of their collective heritage. Yet the disagreements between people like Sally Ash and Melania Kell remind us that even within a single culture, recollections can diverge dramatically. Some prefer to anchor the story in practical realities or blame overshadowed events like the Great Depression and the lure of jobs elsewhere. Others remain convinced that a powerful, mysterious creature roams the vicinity, having never fully left or been driven away. Ultimately, the Portlock Bigfoot incident, often labeled something scientists want to dismiss, holds its grip on imagination precisely because it occupies a space between fact and folklore. Enough eyewitness accounts, physical oddities, and tragic deaths exist to foster a widespread belief in something extraordinary. Yet there is no scientific consensus or definitive evidence, creating a murky realm of speculation that invites endless debate.